Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to Truth Seekers. Today, I'm very excited to announce that we're beginning a new series on the opioid epidemic. I've been wanting to cover this topic for quite some time because I know many people who have been affected by it, having grown up in a place where heroin was literally everywhere. But I needed somebody to help me do this. I need to find someone who has really dug deep into this to help me navigate what quite possibly I felt was a minefield of information. I'm pleased to say that I found just such a person, and he will be our guest tonight. Art Levine is an author and investigative journalist whose work has been featured in major news outlets across the United States. He is the author of Mental Health Incorporated: How Corruption, Lax Oversight, and Failed Reforms Endanger Our Most Vulnerable Citizens, which is available on Amazon, and the link is in the description of this video below. Recently, he has turned his talents and attentions towards investigating the opioid epidemic in the United States. His shocking revelations and conclusions cast new light into a dark story about money, power, influence, and corruption. His shocking conclusions are not only cause for concern, but also a call to action and a major wake-up call. His conclusions cast a bright new spotlight on the failings of our drug laws, policies, and regulations surrounding the drug and rehab industries in the United States. Art Levine's work is essential in understanding the crisis and how we may just solve these major problems that we have so far failed so miserably at. Art Levine's work on the opioid epidemic shows us that we have already lost the so-called war on drugs. His work focuses our attention on what we should do next instead of continuing on this already failed mission. He also looks at the collateral damage to millions of chronic pain patients facing draconian cutbacks in legitimate opioid prescribing, leading to increases in suicides and street use of drugs while worsening their disabilities. Art Levine is a contributing editor of the Washington Monthly and author of the well-received book Mental Health Incorporated. So without further ado, let's welcome him in here, friends.
Hi,
Good
Steve.
to see you. Good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me on this program.
This is my pleasure. I've been wanting to do this for quite some time. Thank you for taking the time to help us do this and do it right with someone like you who can help us navigate this.
And for people who are new to your show, in the past, you've covered a lot of conspiracy theories and debunking in a skeptical way UFOs and conspiracy theories. And what we're facing now in the drug crisis might appear from the outside to be almost a conspiracy, but the point of it is what we're doing now and government policies and in the private healthcare sector also have to be looked at skeptically. So you're a good host for featuring that.
Thank you. And, I know about your book about the mental health industry, but my first question is, how did you pivot from the mental health industry into the opioid epidemic? What got you interested?
Well, what happened is I saw the failings first when I was a reporter in South Florida, and I started covering the failures of our mental health system. And the most extreme examples of that were in the Dade County Jail, where basically you had these brutal conditions that were like in the 18th century for people with untreated mental illness. And I just saw how bad the system worked. And at that point, I had an early belief that all psychiatric medications are always valuable for everybody, which is a common line. Then later I learned that's actually not the case, that there's a lot of massive overprescribing off-label for people who didn't need it. So right now, based on that early knowledge, then I was in the early days in Florida, which was pill mill heaven. By 2000, 2001, the impact of the epidemic was starting to be felt in in Florida, and there were pill mills. There was early reporting that was going on, and there was the beginning of lawsuits that were starting to happen. And I looked at the crisis personally when I did a cover story for a magazine called City Links, no longer around, but it was run by the South Florida Sun Sentinel and the Tribune Company. It was a big cover story, and in it, I learned just so many shocking details. So I interviewed a mother whose son, who had a history of addiction and was on the way to recovery and then had an injury. So he had a history of addictive behavior and problems, then had an injury, was given opioid that was aggressively marketed to doctors, and he ended up becoming addicted and then overdosing. And among the details, horrifying details, is when she was called down from Orlando to come down to Miami, when she went to his home, his blood was still drying. She had to walk through her son's drying blood to look at the scene where he died. And then I learned about the power of the addiction. Now, at this point, you need to understand this is being claimed, and there's books that provide an early window into the early stages of this false marketing. So at that time, Purdue and many doctors were claiming that we needed to look for pain as the fifth vital sign, and they were denying that OxyContin was heavily addictive. Okay. I saw with my own eyes when I talked to people in recovery, people were describing to me what they would do to get opioids and OxyContin. That included pulling their own teeth out with pliers to go into dentist's office so they could get opioids. Okay. And people were stabbing themselves in their arms so they could go to ER and get pain treatment. That's how powerfully addicted it was. And I got very interested in how did that happen. Now, what happened in my reporting for my book was I emphasized and looked at the I looked at the issue of how, in fact, did all this begin. I looked at the corruption that was going on that allowed over-medication of opioids in the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I began looking at that and saw how that went amok, and there was a lot of corruption. So in fact, the first federal guidelines about opioids in general came from a group of scientists who worked for the VA who got grants from Purdue and other opioid manufacturers at the VA and DOD. And the first federal guidelines about opioids in 2003 referred to opioids as, quote, rarely addictive. This is crazy. A federal guideline. Okay. And it's similar to what's described in the book and the movie Dope Sick that's now on Hulu, which has accurate reconstructions of the early days, but has a lot of wrong takeaways about how we solve the problem now. Now, what happened is the FDA, for instance, through a corrupt relationship, the medical reviewer in the FDA added a caveat to the early label for OxyContin that said it was less addictive than other opioids because it supposedly was time released. 2 years later, he gets hired away by Purdue in a delayed bribe to be their medical director. So
there's a lot of connections with the money. The money, when you follow the money, there's a lot of shady stuff going on.
So, but what's happened in the years since, just to move ahead briefly, and then is prescriptions have fallen about, depending on how you measure it, up to 60% for opioids in the last decade. And yet overdoses are skyrocketing. And last year we had, of all drugs, okay, for all drugs, we had 94,000 overdose deaths in 2020, okay? Clearly, and even though prescribing for opioids has gone down so dramatically, opioid fatalities rose nearly 40% last year. So clearly, whatever we think we're doing isn't working at all and is accentuating harm. And that's why I'm following the lead of such pioneer journalists as Maya Sazalowicz, whose new book is Undoing Drugs, about the importance of harm reduction. And that should be the guiding principle derived from the Hippocratic Oath of medicine: first, do no harm.
Do no harm, yeah.
And everything about our drug policies for both people with substance abuse disorders and chronic pain is crazy and insane. I kind of feel like the history of American drug policy, starting in the early 20th century with classifying drugs, and there was is basically like a horror movie. You know, when you're watching a horror movie and you see the young innocent teenagers, they're going to go into the room where the killer is, and you go, no, don't do that. That's essentially every single decision our government, our insurance policies, and our clinicians have made for 100 years has always been wrong and has led to more harm. It's just it's so bad. And there are ways to get out of this mess. Unfortunately, they're not being followed as much as they should be.
Well, so let's get into the origins of some of these drugs like OxyContin. What can you tell us about the origins of OxyContin and how they so aggressively were able to market it to doctors and even incentivize doctors to write more prescriptions?
Right. Well, it's in books like Dreamland and books like Dopesick, which is now the Hulu series. It's relatively accurate about the early days. So essentially, this was a company owned by the Sackler family that was a relatively smaller company called Purdue. And what happened is they had a short-acting drug that was legitimate called MS Contin, and then they worked out a formulation for a longer acting drug, and then they realized, they would be able to have higher dosages, but it would be over time, and they claimed that it would last 12 hours, people could sleep through the night. Very early on, they realized that they were not actually lasting 12 hours, and the addictive potential was very high. But they came up with a meme. It's a kind of a crazy detail, but they came up with a meme and point of view, which is opioids in general and OxyContin in particular have less than a 1% addictive potential. So that was the claim.
I couldn't believe that when I heard it in this Dopesick thing.
Right.
I couldn't believe that.
So
1% is crazy.
Here's the origins of that. It's called the Jinx letter, which is written at the mid-1980s. It's a letter from guys based in a hospital to, I believe, it was the New England Journal. It's called the Jinx letter. It was JINKS, I think. Anyway, 5 sentences in a letter to JAMA, okay? And what did that letter say? 5 sentences were, we've been treating patients with acute pain in our hospital, and we've been giving them opioids, and we give them, presumably a little amount when they are discharged. And we find that less than 1% of the acute pain people emerging from a hospital become addicted. So that became this fig leaf for this massive publicity and PR campaign. So this 5-sentence letter then began to be referred to by the salesman of Purdue as a major study in the Journal of the American Medical Association, meaning it wasn't a peer-reviewed study. The actual addiction potential, if you don't screen for people's backgrounds for chronic pain patients, may be in the 8% range, including some people who are the head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse now. So it is still, for people with chronic pain, the addiction potential is not as great as is commonly believed, but obviously it's there. Now, what happened was the level of fault is every single institution failed and money played the role. So it's sort of hard to believe, but basically, well, it's not hard to believe. It's the reporting has come out and all the litigation. Purdue had to pay out like, over, $3 billion or $4 billion in a settlement, but nobody went to jail in the top leadership. And they had this settlement and they went into bankruptcy. And part of the deal was they couldn't go after the actual Sackler family members who were still alive who drove this policy. But the craziness here is they managed to corrupt everybody. It's like
yeah, it's like a dominoes, right? They all
right.
fell. Every institution and safeguard just fell like dominoes, one after another.
So they created a series of myths, like there's an objective measurement for pain. Pain is very subjective. So they created a 1 to 10 chart of smiling faces and unhappy faces, and you would pick inside a hospital room where it would. And they created front group pain societies with, quote, independent doctors who they either created or funded or subsidized in full or part to be independent experts. So they created, and then of course they paid doctors, and this is a trick that they learned from the marketers like Pfizer and AstraZeneca and others from psychoactive drugs, like Seroquel and Risperdal and all those things. This is a trick. You find hacks to craft medical studies, and then you get a big deal academic to sign off. And then they get it published.
And of course, these people are all paid for their work, supporting the conclusions the drug industry wants, right?
Right, absolutely. I mean, there's studies that show that, and it wasn't until, and it's still not widely enforced, that for years and years and years, people didn't disclose. And then when they disclose who is paying for them, or they lied about it. And it is still very weakly enforced. But so what happened is they find big name academics to write articles with their prestige for, quote, peer-reviewed journals, many of whom are also getting drug money, okay? And then say how wonderful these drugs are, and then it sort of spreads out. But they also essentially bribe the Joint Commission, which is the kind of general healthcare organization for hospitals, and they themselves would be endorsing and promoting the use of opioids in hospitals. And then it was just like, and then the worst of it, it's hard to say, like, who are the worst players? My view about all of this is there was a comedic novel from the 1960s called The Magic Christian, written by Terry Southern. And the comedic premise of the book was later made into a movie with Peter Sellers and Ringo Starr, is money can corrupt anyone to do anything. And he would do things in the novel like take the biggest prize fight in Britain. And this is when everybody was very homophobic. And he'd have the two heavyweight champions come out and he'd pay them millions to start making out and kissing in the middle of a televised prize fight just for giggles. So that the point was people will do anything for money. Money drove so much of this bad policy, which then influenced, unfortunately, doctors. And so, but one of the worst players is, beside the FDA giving this bogus letter, the FDA claiming with no research based on negotiating with Purdue lobbyists, okay, behind the scenes, no evidence, it's less addictive because a Purdue lobbyist tells the FDA that tells the FDA that there is it's less addictive because it's time release, and the FDA goes, "Yep, we agree." And I found that when I was looking at the expansion of marketing and for the different groups for antipsychotic drugs. But then the DEA itself, the DEA basically did nothing whatsoever. And it's for years and years and years. as they let these massive oversupplies go on and on and on in these, particularly in these Appalachian hill towns and smaller areas. They did nothing. So there's a new book out by a Charleston Gazette journalist about a small town in West Virginia that basically got like 400 people and 4 million pills over several years, because it was clearly a diversion center. And what happened is the DEA did nothing. And one of the reasons they did nothing is money will get you anything. So Purdue and the other opioid had a brilliant idea. Why don't we go into the actual DEA counsel's office and start hiring them away to work for us?
Yeah, so then you got all the DEAs working for them, and they're buddies they're still friends with the people that are still running the DEA. So they get a pass. Yeah, you get a pass.
So that is very similar to, in general, there's a book out called Dirty Money, which looks at the failure of any white collar criminals to ever go to prison for anything. That's a general rule of thumb. And my solution is what I call the Bubba solution, is get some white collar executives in a jail cell with a guy named Bubba for about 5
the Bubba
years.
Solution. Yeah.
And then get it publicized, and you might see a reduction in white collar crime across the board. And a lot of it, of course, is in the drug field. In fact, so the DA gutted enforcement by hiring it away. And then in 2016, when it was really obvious and raging, there was a law passed that, and 60 Minutes did a show on this, there was a law passed that kind of snuck through Congress that tied the hands of the DA to enforce opioid limits in any meaningful way. Okay. But what happened subsequently is the DEA now has devolved into a pretty dangerous operation, because they helped accentuate the opioid epidemic by doing nothing. Now they're going overboard, and they're going overboard in this regard. They are the deciders of who is prescribing legitimately opioids for chronic pain. And they're driving down the DA, made up of these hardcore law enforcement people with no medical knowledge, are driving down the prescribing of opioids and helping threaten and force good doctors out of the medical field with the threat of prosecution or the reality of prosecution. Plus they are further stigmatizing the notion of prescribing any opioids. And this is something being looked at by the Health Justice Lab out of Northeastern University under the direction of law professor Leo Beletsky, is homicide prosecutions for doctors acting in good faith who are prescribing opioids. If anybody dies, they then prosecute them for murder. And then also they're prosecuting, someone who's in the group of shooters when someone is shooting up and dies. So they're using this like scare tactic, and it's not at all reducing opioids. But the DEA right now is, it basically, and in her new book, Undoing Drugs, Maya points out that what we're seeing also with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement is just how much law enforcement is tied into this kind of racial enforcement of drugs. So basically, blacks are jailed like 6 times more than white people for the same drug offenses. I mean, it's really outrageous. So the DA at this point is, after letting opioid addiction run amok, and then doing nothing, and then shilling for the drug industry by having their lawyers and agents go work for the drug industry. Now they're stopping doctors from prescribing both Suboxone. They often, in some cases, prosecute them because they're prescribing too much Suboxone, or for pain patients. And Suboxone is buprenorphine. That's the easier to, that's the brand name, is Suboxone. They're prosecuting some of them for doing that as well as patients. And then what's the other thing they do? They kick down the doors of Black people and help shoot them under suspected warrants of being drug dealers. I mean, that's basically their main function. Sort of jump outs, chasing down people with warrants, heavily militarized, which is also influencing how police departments handle drugs, and, prosecuting usually well-meaning. That doesn't mean there aren't totally irresponsible doctors who are still engaging in pill mill type behavior deserve to be prosecuted. So the whole thing is horribly done on every front.
Yeah, and can we talk a little bit about the lobbying that goes on in Washington, and what part do you think that plays in it? Because I've often thought like the senators should have to wear like race car drivers, like they should have to have a Pfizer on their suit, or Purdue over here. We have so that we know who bought and paid for these people that are allowing this to continue.
I always thought that was a great idea to show. I mean, the lobbying, it is, there's always something that they want to do. And so they lobby. I don't have the latest big pharma lobbying things, but I learned about the big lobbying occurs not just in Congress, but on regulatory agencies. So one of the key things, there was an important study that came out several years ago from the Health Research Group by the Ralph Nader Organization, Public Citizen Health. So they found over the last 25 years, drug companies have paid out $35 billion in different fines and settlements.
This is so crazy, yeah.
But more than defense departments, defense contractors. It used to be the earlier big fraudsters. Now it's the drug companies. The key point is that they never get meaningfully punished. So in all these settlements, and I dug into this, they're referred to the Inspector General's office of HHS to monitor the settlement. And they always ignore the settlement over and over and over again. There's no meaningful consequence. So I literally, and this, when I was drilling into why is it that Pfizer, AstraZeneca, almost every company was repeatedly fined in the billions. I'm not talking about the opioids, but psychoactive drugs, for violating off-label marketing, claiming, that this antipsychotic could cure anxiety or something, and I actually spoke with a guy from the Inspector General's office, and this is representative of the entire government. So I spoke to this guy and I said, what have you done to, hold to account any of the drug companies who violate agreements that you're supposed to be enforced? And he said, can you give me an example? And he said, let me get back to you. So then a few weeks later, he, quote, got back to me, and he found something a decade earlier, which they fined somebody $3,000. Now, if you make tens of billions of dollars, over the patented life of a drug, even a
that little bit of, that's a slap on the wrist. They'll just pay that, and it's part of the cost of doing business for them, right?
Yeah, but here's the point: the fine and move on. They're so rich that even these settlements that are covered in the news, like Pfizer paid $2.3 billion for false marketing, or over $3 billion, whatever the exact figure is. The news, this is amazing. Oh, we're getting tough. Well, if you're making per drug, let's say $5 billion on the psychoactive drugs, it's much higher for Purdue on OxyContin. Let's say you make $5 billion as AstraZeneca, what AstraZeneca did on its Seroquel, which later shown to have really high risk of heart arrhythmias and was causing needless deaths of veterans and others. You get $5 billion a year for 17 years. That's how long the patent lasts. So at the end of your crime spree and your false marketing, somebody catches up with you and say, oh boy, we want the $2 billion. I mean, who cares? It's like chump change. It is literally called chump change.
It's very similar to the stuff about people on Wall Street who get caught with insider trading, and they give them a fine. They make $300 million doing something dirty, and then the FCC fines them, a $500,000 or something. They still got away with all that, the difference of the money.
Oh yeah, and one of the reasons it's very similar to the hollowing out of the DEA by Purdue by taking the lawyers. And Matt Tabai did a lot of good reporting about this for Rolling Stone in the white collar financial crime industry. And what happened is so many of the SEC lawyers got hired away by the defense people, and they still knew people. So they would cut these friendly deals for their, white collar crime executives.
It's just terrible. So you were telling me a little bit about, we've talked about these effects. Then there's been, because of this, all these doctors are now somewhat terrified, right, to prescribe opioids.
Right.
Now the scale went way further the other way now.
Absolutely. And
people are suffering because of that now, because they can't get, and even if they have a valid need for a painkiller, it's difficult to get now.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the things. And I was reporting on this. I did some early research in 2018, and then I began publishing some articles when I finally got news organizations to pay attention in 2019 about the draconian impact. And I interviewed the wife of Jay Lawrence, who basically who committed suicide because a doctor, even though he was in an agonizing accident, couldn't get access to legitimately prescribed opioids and was not a drug abuser. And so what's happened is that now the data is starting to pour in, and the guy who's doing the best research on it, and we'll be posting it, is Dr. Stefan Cortez, who's sort of the leading medical intellectual in the field now. And he has a new presentation that pulls it all together, both how we went overboard in over-medication early and how now we're going in the opposite direction with very serious damage. And he has a study he's doing looking at suicide effects and recruiting family members to interview, and that'll be available on his Twitter feed. But here's some of the things that have occurred is that it's been shown that this sudden sensation, and this is according to a very recent study in the Journal of General and Internal Medicine, that sensation of legitimate prescribing has led to a 3 times greater risk of overdose deaths. So the point is, under the myth that if we just stop prescribing opioids for long-term chronic pain patients, we're really helping them out. And we are, in fact, it's going to be great for them because they're at lower risk of overdose. No, they're turning to street drugs or they're killing themselves. And now the suicide data is really starting to come in. So there's a new study that came in Oregon, which is an example of a state that has extremely aggressive enforcement and cutbacks. And so a new study has come out that shows, and it just came out in April of this year, and it showed that cessation in Oregon Medicaid is associated with a 3 to 5 times greater risk of suicide. That includes people actually killing themselves or having what's called suicidal ideation. So up to 5 times more people are either killing themselves or in the throes of Great Depression and thinking seriously about it because they're being shut off. And what's even more remarkable, and this is kind of hard to believe because you wouldn't know about it at the state and local level, most federal agencies, starting in 2019 through 2020 and some of this year, that includes the FDA, the CDC, HHS, and also advisory groups like the American Medical Association, have published papers saying we shouldn't be enforcing forced tapering in a fast way for chronic pain patients who are stable. So this is all of the major organizations have said, and a lot of it has to do with guidelines that came about in 2016 by the CDC, which were informal recommendations for family physicians that they should try in initiating, not go above what's called 90 morphine milligram equivalent drugs. But that was an advisory. So what happened is that 90 MME figure advised in 2016 became a hard and fast rule across the country. Do not ever prescribe more than that for anyone, no matter what their condition is, what their genetic health condition that's causing agony. And there's about 200 genetic conditions that have severe pain that merit appropriate prescription. So what's happened is this informal advisory, the CDC basically went on into the New England Journal of Medicine about 2020, maybe 2019, saying, hey, folks, our guidelines from 2016, they're kind of being misapplied and people are being hurt. Please don't do these forced taperings anymore. That was totally ignored. It got some tension in the chronic pain advocacy community among researchers, but in real life, state health boards, clinics in the state and localities, insurance companies, DA, everybody totally ignored it. And it's kind of crazy. So the consensus medical opinion from experts is don't do drastic, fast, forced tapering of chronic pain patients, particularly those who are stable. And I've profiled people. So for Newsweek, I did a story of a guy who was a really amazing, he was an ex-Marine who was an Olympic contender. And then he had an injury when he was a younger man, a veteran of Vietnam War and other wars. And he was perfectly stable and had his own business. And he was taking regular opioids as part of treatment for regular, severe, intractable pain. And then they just cut him off. And now he can't do anything. He can't hold a job. And he is unable to even bend over and tie his own shoes. So this guy used to be an incredible Olympic level athlete, can't tie his own shoes. And if he wants to pat his own young son on the head, he can't reach over without being in agony. Now, under what world is this considered rational? It's not.
It's not. Totally nutty. Absolutely not. Yeah. So they've gone a little too far the other way then and sort of vilified the prescribing of opioids, even when people really need them. And it's easy to see how, if you're like, let's say you've been in chronic pain for 3 years and the doctors won't give you anything to help with it. Yeah, you're going to get depressed and suicidal, maybe living with that chronic pain and feeling hopeless, So let's talk about some of this harm reduction, because I have personal experience with this, but the one thing that I disagree with is safe injection sites, because in the area in Philadelphia I used to live, there was just so many people affected by opiates and heroin addicts and other things. They decide they're going to do a safe injection site, and then the number of the people, that were sort of homeless hanging around that were addicted tripled in the area where they put the safe injection site or were going to.
I would doubt that data. What I'm getting at is the safe injection site is one wing of what's called harm reduction.
Yeah, let's get into it and explain what is this concept.
And basically, the notion of harm reduction is several-fold, and basically the safe injection sites are sort of an outgrowth of what became during the AIDS era, the needle exchanges, and for clean needles, so intravenous drug users who were getting AIDS would not get AIDS. Okay, that's the origin of this concept, and this is again well chronicled in Maya Szalowicz's new book, which I recommend everyone to read. but also, so this is kind of an extension of that. And part of the value is, so I would look closely when you hear, oh, where they opened up safe injection sites, oh boy, drug abuse tripled because of that's not the case.
Yeah, and I wasn't citing any data. It was my personal observation that some areas seem to have much more people. There's this whole thing in Philadelphia of like homeless camps of people that
right.
are affected by heroin and tent cities and things. And it just seemed to me maybe it was just a regular increase, because it just seemed to be in Philadelphia. It's like the world's worst kept secret. If you want to be addicted, you just go to that area, and the police leave them alone. They don't.
But I guess my view is it's better to keep people alive than to throw them in jail. And the other thing is, there's a really other great book on the notion of decriminalization. So in Oregon, they're decriminalizing possession of small amounts of anything, including cocaine and heroin and marijuana and so on. And one of the things is we can look at the results in Portugal, which is in the book Chasing the Scream. And he studied, so this was a place that turned to really making harm reduction front and center of their thing. What happened is when they made it medically available, overdoses dropped significantly and they didn't arrest people. And so so I understand it may look like, what I'm getting at is there may be more people in that area because they're going. I don't think there's so many things that go into turning someone into shooting drugs or misusing drugs that the availability of a safe outlet after you become addicted is not a key factor. And that's a myth that's also driving how difficult it is in a lot of cases to get naloxone, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, which is this drug you can now get in many cities over the counter without a prescription, and it is used to get people to recover from overdoses. And there's a long-acting version that shows some efficacy, but the short-acting version should be. I have one in my car, and my feeling is that anyone who knows anyone who has an addiction issue around an opioid should be carrying this in their pocket. And even friends,
it saves lives.
Right, it absolutely saves lives, and and it's unpleasant to be revived from an overdose, but it's way better than living,
or way better than dying. Yeah,
right, and it's way better than dying. And naloxone is now nasally available, so this kind of. Everybody remembers the Pulp Fiction scene when Uma Thurman is on the carpet and they revive her with a big fat needle through the chest.
Yeah,
that's not how it works today. It's a gentle nasal spray that can save somebody's life. And naloxone, and most cops don't have it. Most people don't have it. And the upshot of it is that it should be widely available and can help prevent overdoses. But where we really get into overdose and addiction dysfunction, and addiction is now described, and again, this has been emphasized by Maya Szalowitz and others, addiction is now described of compulsive use of a substance repeatedly in the face of harmful consequences, as opposed to just using it. In other words, so if you drink a drug, if you occasionally drink liquor, but you're not compulsively using it and you're not losing your job, your wife, your so on, you're not really addicted, even if you're regularly drinking. But so the point is, this Suboxone, which is a variation of buprenorphine, is so underused and for so many reasons. So right now, 2/3 of all treatment facilities in the U.S. don't make this medication-assisted treatment available. That is insane. So
I know at least two people that got off of heroin with Suboxone. I know at least two. You
and
know,
and
and they were long-term heroin users that were in and out of rehab for many years. But once they got the Suboxone, they were able to get off of the heroin completely. Can you explain
and
to us a little bit
that
about Suboxone and what it is and how it works?
yeah, it's a
Because there's
chemical that's
confusion.
kind of it binds in some of the similar places, but it doesn't have the negative effects and doesn't create a high. So it doesn't create the kind of compulsive overuse that leads to addiction. So it can bind in similar areas of the brain and makes it easier to stop using the really dangerous opioids. Uh, and but the point of it is that but one of the reasons it's so rare is that we have this crazy system for this really effective drug. So it would be like if in the right now you have to get these special X waivers, even though they've tinkered with it. They're called X waivers for doctors who want to treat more than 30 people. And if you treat more than 30 people, you're going to get the attention of the DEA. But these crazy little restrictions make it very difficult for a lot of doctors to prescribe it, and there's no incentive to prescribe it. That's another key thing. It's sort of like if what would have happened in the middle of the polio epidemic if in the middle of the polio epidemic, doctors had to fill out lots of paperwork and sit through 8 hours of training on how to use the Sabin or Salk vaccines. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
What would
it's
happen?
ridiculous.
What would have
If you have a
happened?
drug, I don't understand if you have this drug that is so incredibly effective, why it's not more commonly used.
It's part of a basically puritanical, punitive approach that I think it's kind of reflective of a philosophy of government that I think got to the height in the Trump administration, which is cruelty is the point. The belief is widespread in a lot of, even if you're, it doesn't mean that you're a right winger necessarily. The concept is there's the belief that drug users need to hit bottom and really suffer. And unless they suffer and suffer and suffer and hit bottom, they're not going to change. So the notion that there's a way where they could safely transition from their opioids to something like buprenorphine and reduce, in France, it's been shown to reduce overdoses 75%. Here, it's 50%. If you could cut half of our, enormous overdose deaths, with this medication, it should be widely used, and it isn't. And I think it's part of a culture of punishment, and also I do think it reflects a view in the treating community, the law enforcement community, and health regulators that people with substance abuse are kind of bad people or less than human or evil. Now, but that has changed with the rise of the opioid epidemic. And there's a big reason it changed in terms of more thought of compassion and need for more treatment. It's when white kids began dying in droves. Before
Yeah,
then,
yeah. Before that, it wasn't a big issue, right?
yeah, when black people did
Those
it,
terrible black people are doing heroin in the ghetto. Who cares, right?
right? Or
Once it reached the suburb, I noticed once I started hearing from friends and coworkers that lived in the suburbs that their children were going down into Philly to buy, OxyContin pills or whatever, Percocets. Then I started to notice there was a marked change. Like, you're right, we got to do something about this because now suddenly it's affecting suburban white people. It's a shame, but that's the reality of what happened,
that
right?
discrimination was shown in the in the drug enforcement laws, which was rock, crack, cocaine. You got a much higher sentence than if you used powder cocaine.
Yeah, of course, yeah,
And 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 this is part of the absurdity of it. But that's where there's something called harmreduction.org, and I'm also going to be we're going to be putting in a resource guide where people can look up some of the latest research and findings on these issues. And so one of the things to keep in mind here is that this is being so mismanaged, and I am kind of shocked. If we now, it really is hard to believe. I was reading in her book in the opening section, when we look at all overdoses of all kinds, and most people who took opioids are often taking other drugs legally or illegally as well, and so they mix together. But if you count all opioids for all overdoses from all sources, nearly 1 million people have died since 1999. It's so crazy, and we're using these really old-fashioned policies to deal with the modern health challenge, and that's what we need to take care of right now, in a fresh way.
And I'm just sharing the website harmreduction.org, which is a good resource, from what I've seen. And it seems like, they really want to affect drug policy to be pushed more to harm reduction. And I've always thought that, I don't know what I feel about drug decriminalization, but it's clear to me that it's not a criminal issue. It's a health issue. And it should be treated more like a health issue than a crime issue.
Well, about 1 million people are arrested a year. So we have 2.3 million people. Now, the figures vary. We have 2.3 million incarcerated right now in jails and prisons. 1 million people a year are arrested locally for drug offenses. Now, the actual percentage of people in incarceration now that are charged directly with drugs is 20%, but it's much higher a figure if you count where someone is committing a crime, or there's a shooting, or there's a turf rivalry, or they're stealing, and they're not charged with a drug offense. So it's very significant. And one of the biggest places that is a cause of death is people get incarcerated and they're not given access to, they're made to go cold turkey off their drugs if they're on it. They're not given the option of getting medication assisted treatment like Suboxone or other things, either in jail, in most jails, and certainly not when they are discharged. And it's considered, I don't know how many times higher, but it's hundreds of percent higher likelihood of overdose and death in the weeks following discharge from jail, okay? Because they've been cleaned out, sort of forced in, and now they're, quote, opioid naive. They're lonely, they're depressed, they can't find work. They take a drug and it's been out of their system, but they don't have any safer alternatives, and then they overdose. So it really, like, basically this entire system. There's a line from a study some decades ago about our educational system, and in it they said and this applies to our entire drug system and drug policy system, if this drug, and I'm paraphrasing this report on education, if our drug system and drug policy was imposed on us by a foreign country, it would be viewed as an act of war. And that's what this is. It's like, literally, there isn't one element of commonly used procedures or policy or enforcement or treatment for addiction or handling of chronic pain that is handled correctly. So naturally, you're going to have increases in suicide. You're going to have increases in overdoses. You'd think if 94,000 people died of overdoses of all kind in 1 year alone last year. Obviously, it was worsened by the pandemic in many respects because of the stress of being out of work, the loneliness, and so on. But you'd think, hello, 5-alarm fire here,
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, because I'm a little bit I'm not very well informed about this, because I've had friends that were opioid addicts in one form or another. Some people that I grew up with and knew, because of the neighborhood that we grew up with, it was everywhere. And there's lots of people addicted to either prescription pain pills like Oxycontin, or to actual going to heroin and shooting
Right.
heroin. So several people I know have gotten off of heroin with Suboxone, but others have gone to a methadone clinic and that kind of treatment program. Can you talk about the effectiveness of the methadone method, and what is methadone and how does it work, and what,
I don't know. The methadone has been around much longer. The issue with methadone is this: it's really effective if it is titrated up correctly and personalized. In other words, the reason that Suboxone is taken off in terms of interest is it has it's a better safety profile, and you can use it at home. Okay.
Okay. So methadone, you have to go. I know from my friends, you have to go to the clinic and get your shot of methadone.
You have to go to the clinic and you're monitored in these sort of horrific, cinder block locations, go into terrible neighborhoods and stand in line and get it. I mean, but on the other hand, it has a very good track record. The difficulty is that, and there have been, if people are not being monitored carefully for where their opioid levels are at when they start methadone treatment, there is risks that they may face. On the other hand, it's been very, very beneficial. It's an older form of treatment, but it is extremely beneficial.
And what is it? But is methadone sort of a replacement for an opiate, and then they slowly wean you off? They give you lower and lower doses.
No.
Is that how the treatment works?
You get it binds. It binds
to the same receptor.
Brain cells.
Yes.
It is an alternative to really dangerous opioids that create a need for upping the dosage. So when they get the right dosage for methadone, you get the drug, but you can have a family life, you can hold down a job, and so on. So I'm just saying that it's worth considering for people who's already using addictive drugs. Now, what actually is also happening, the shortage of the ability to get Suboxone has led to a street trade on Suboxone.
Yeah, people in the live chat are mentioned. There's some people in the live chat who mentioned that they buy Suboxone on the street.
Now that's this is how crazy things are. A lot of people now are buying it, and it's sold on the street, and you have to pray to God that it is in fact really Suboxone. And one of the things about street drugs is that whenever you buy something on the street, it could be laced with fentanyl, illegally imported and made to look like a counterfeit pill. You have no idea whether it's labeled correctly, what it is. And that even applies to Suboxone. And it's a sign. Now, I don't know whether this is true or not. Basically, people who could be in medically monitored Suboxone treatment are basically taking Suboxone they buy on the street to allow them to manage cold turkey in between getting their next opioid hit or shot, either pills or shot. And so they take street Suboxone to allow them to weather the chills and withdrawal.
Yeah, the withdrawal symptoms. They're taking it just to manage the withdrawal symptoms. But the fact that they have to get it on the street is crazy to me.
It's crazy. It should not be like this.
Yeah, I mean, if it was up to me, especially near where I grew up, which is Kensington and Philadelphia, I mean, there's all these tent cities with all these people on heroin. They should be down there handing out Suboxone to all those people.
Yeah,
they should have access to this.
The other thing about it is, I don't know, the long-term safety profile is fantastic, but if you're in a medical setting, you have a reasonable chance of getting into other kinds of treatment to deal with the underlying psychological issues that helped bring about the addiction in the first place. But one of the points that I highlight, and by the way, one of the people listening is the excellent Stefan Cortez. Check his thing, his Twitter feed at Stefan Cortez. He's basically the best informed guy out there about the range of issues. Him and at Maya SZ. If you just follow those two people, and then Kate Nicholson speaking about pain, those three, you follow those three, you'll be really informed on both harm reduction and what is at stake in the in terms of the chronic pain community. And they're both.
And we thank them for the work that they do, because this is important work and people need to be educated on these issues.
Yeah, and they're basically, and that's where I in my resource guide that we'll be posting later, I refer to something called Changing the Narrative, where it is changing the narrative. Is there's so much disinformation and stigmatizing language and all of that we're just a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And so one of the things is almost anything that you hear about from most doctors and treatment facilities who are overwhelmingly opposed to using medicated assisted treatment for opioids. I mean, basically, the government, like the 12-step programs, can be very valuable as an adjunct to other things. But if you shouldn't be in a program where the sole method of dealing with your addiction is to sit in a 12-step program that you could do for free at a nearby church.
Yeah, and isn't it medically dangerous for people to just go? Because I have one friend who quit heroin. He hit rock bottom. He lost his family, his children, and then one day he woke up and he said, "I'm kicking heroin." And he kicked heroin cold turkey. He was a heroin user for 5 years, and he thought he was going to die. He ended up walking himself to the hospital, a nearby hospital, and they didn't give him any form of treatment. They just sort of, gave him an IV and try to talk to him about getting counseling for his drug addiction. But they didn't give him any medical assistance. And it seems to me to be very cruel, because when somebody is kicking heroin, they're throwing up, their bones hurt, they're having all these body aches, they're in terrible, terrible pain. There's got to be some medical intervention there to help them.
There is, but it's not used. And there's my feeling. I have my big simple solution for all our nation's drug policies is have as co-directing drug czars of the country Maya Zalovitz, the author, and researcher Stefan Cortez, and have them set national drug policy, and then everybody follow what they say. But that's not going to happen. But in a world of philosopher kings, that would happen. Now, Lord Ludacris Plaid has mentioned that he's someone who's in favor of long-term Suboxone use. So maybe he can comment, or he can ask a question, or so on. He seems to be someone with personal experience. So,
it's interesting that, and of course, I'm not saying this in a derogatory way, but I had no idea how many of my viewers and listeners have been affected by opiates. A lot of these people are long-term listeners, and tonight I'm hearing their stories about their one-time addiction and how they treated their addiction through either Suboxone or other treatments. That's how many people are affected. That we've got all these people in my audience I didn't even know that had issues in the past. Because it's not a common thing that people bring up. But since we're talking about it on the show tonight, people are sharing their personal stories, which is great.
Yeah. And it is still shocking to me that these reasonable policies are not widely used. And I'm not sure. That's one of the things that's really tragic about the healthcare system. Years ago, there was a very general look at how does evidence-based approaches to any medical thing, about the best approach to deal with surgery, or best approach to deal with heart attacks. Unfortunately, according to the GAO, and then there's also the National Academy of Sciences, there's usually a 30-year gap between what is in the medical literature about what work for any medical or addiction issue, and when it's widely implemented. Well, we can't have a 30-year gap before we do the right thing if 90,000, 4,000 people a year are dying of drug overdoses. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't have that. You can't have that.
You can't just let everybody suffer for 30 years while the medical industry and the doctors catch up. And isn't a part of the problem too? And not to take it. Listen, doctors are. I've known some great doctors. Uh, go forward and learn what the best current treatments are. They just remember what they knew from medical school, which could have been.
So one of the key points that Dr. Cortez makes is the lack of training. It's just crazy. We've been since 1999, we've had a massive opioid crisis, and we've had a concomitant collateral damage of chronic pain patients suffering from extreme sharp withdrawals that are preventable. There's so little training on either addiction treatment or dealing with chronic pain or pain management in a responsible way in medical schools. So they come out totally ignorant, and then they just pick up folklore. In other words, the different. So right now, actual doctors learn what they learn from two sources: folklore, with often erroneous word of mouth, and whatever the drug industry sales rep is doing them. Okay. And I'm friendly with some of the people listening are part of the very sophisticated chronic pain advocacy community, like Lelina Peacock. And
yeah,
others.
Thank you for your work. It's much needed and appreciated,
and
Lelina.
Really knows a lot. I've quoted her in articles, and yes, and there she just mentioned the issue of stigma. So basically, it's less so because so many celebrities have ended up dying that from overdoses, that we're more aware of it. But there's still this stigma, and this is a kind of bizarre idea. But I kind of wish, I'm a huge music lover, I kind of wish we could go back in time and save Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Brian Jones.
There's so many affected. Yeah.
All these amazing, great artists.
Jim Morrison as well.
Jim Morrison, all of these people, if they had access to really effective care and treatment. That is one of the things that I've posted is a really smart, I posted some information. There's a book by Ann Fletcher that I think anyone with addiction or family member with addiction should read. It's called Inside Rehab, and it's by Ann Fletcher. But I've also posted articles by Maya, and I am also posting stuff from the Harm Reduction Coalition and the Kate Nicholson's National Pain Advocacy Center, and all of these.
We've got these resources in the About section. I wasn't able to fit them all, so we're going to be editing it after the show to get them all in. Like I said, Mr. Levine gave me this treasure trove of resources for people that's so data rich, and there's so much that I had trouble fitting it all in before broadcast time, but we will be editing it so that all those resources will be available for anybody that needs them.
When I was reading Maya's book, she does interviews with mothers of people who died of drug overdoses, and neither they nor their children knew anything about naloxone, which could revive people from overdoses. Nothing. Literally nothing. No one told them a thing. And it's just, I am kind of at a loss because I follow a lot of bad developments in public policy, in terms of authoritarianism and bad developments and voting. I don't have a simple explanation for why every single element of anything to do with drugs in our country is always the wrong thing.
Yeah.
that's sort of where we're at. I
You know,
feel.
we have an excellent question here that is actually on my list. Uh, Mr. Levine, what are your suggestions these days for a path for chronic pain? It appears there are a few routes.
Well, I think a part of it is trying to educate your own doctor, and that's where for basically, if you start having chronic pain, in other words, before you become using opioids, there's different modalities that might be helpful for back pain. I happen to know because I suffered from myself. There's something called Doctors of Physical Medicine, can help a lot. For those who are already using opioids and wanting to maintain dosages, it's difficult, but some of the information at the National Pain Advocacy Center and in the research of Stefan Cortez can give you maybe some ammunition to deal with your doctors. Because what's happening overwhelmingly, doctors are under so much pressure not to prescribe opioids that they're forcing people out. So one of the things that's happened, like in Tennessee, and there's another advocate and researcher named Terry Lewis, who I follow regularly. So in Tennessee, basically they shut down different pain clinics, maybe because there was some overprescribing, but more likely they just shut it down because they had too many people taking opioids, even if they weren't drug abusers. And like tens of thousands of pain patients were let out on the street with no options for anything. Now, someone just mentioned kratom. Now,
Yeah, I wanted to get into that
I think
because
that I don't think it should be banned, but I think the evidence is uneven. If that is your only option, it is probably worth trying, but the evidence for it isn't really great, and there are some risks, particularly if you're basically buying it illegally. So it's
well,
a little.
it's legal. It's illegal in 6 states in the United States, I believe,
It's
and
legal in 6 states or illegal?
it's illegal in only 6 states.
Okay.
Like for example, in my state, you can get it at any like tobacco or smoke shop. They
So
sell it.
I'm not going to see, part of what drives me as a journalist, and I guess I'm an advocacy journalist as well, although I follow the forms and norms of mainstream journalism, is what does the evidence say? And that has always shaped my views. So all I'm saying is I don't know the evidence pro and con. I have a good word of advice, which is whatever you read on Facebook, in some private Facebook group on anything, whether it's vaccine,
You got to check.
COVID,
Yeah.
or kratom, maybe think twice, because there's so much bad information out there. And here's the thing about fentanyl. Someone, CK Benzona. Fentanyl is appropriate for severe pain as a patch or other legally appropriate uses for severe pain, but that is not what is happening in the street drugs. We have manufactured illegal fentanyl swamping, coming in, people ordering it on the internet, swamping from China and other overseas sources, and a whole bunch of fake pills end up on the street. And so that is part of the situation that we're in. So fentanyl, there's so much misinformation about it. So one of the myths, and that is where writers like Zach Siegel and scholars like Leo Beletsky have pointed out, one of the myths about fentanyl is it's so dangerous that if in a warehouse and it's in a box, 50 yards away, you could die from being in the area. And there's all these reports from law enforcement officers about how their police were endangered by being anywhere near the near the drug, and that's just not true. That's even the illegal drug, but nobody should take it. But here's what's so bad is people can get arrested right now if you have in possession some. Now, this is something I just read. I may be incorrect on it. That if you have a way of testing about whether your illegally obtained drug has fentanyl, you can be arrested because the testing device for fentanyl or methods of testing is considered drug paraphernalia. Now in
That's ridiculous.
Vancouver,
Yeah.
now this is where this thing
So
about
just to be clear though, Art, there is a test, because I want to be very clear on this point. So because this is a big issue that I've thought a lot about. There is a testing kit which you can get that you can use on the drugs that you obtain, which will tell you if the drug that you're testing has fentanyl in it or not. Right?
right.
And
That's
since
that's
fentanyl is so deadly, to
right.
me, everybody should be allowed to have those kits. If you're going to use drugs, at
Right,
least you should know
absolutely.
what you're taking.
Yeah,
And this
that's part
this
of
kit can help you know this has fentanyl in it. I shouldn't use this.
yes.
Right?
That's my understanding that there are, but the question is how available it is, how widely used is it, and to what degree do different law enforcement treat having that as a form of drug paraphernalia. In contrast, in Vancouver, when they had a medically approved site where people could obtain their drugs under some kind of medical monitoring, they were allowed to test for fentanyl. Guess what? About 85% of the drugs that they were then allowed to test had fentanyl in it. So that means you could prevent 85% of deaths. That seems like a good thing. And
If I had my way, I'd be running around handing out Suboxone and these testing kits to the area that I grew up near. Because there's just so much.
well,
There's all
that's
these
one of
tent
the things
cities,
is
and
I don't know basically under a very liberal DA, you had a kind of a place for safe drug use, little pockets allowed in Philadelphia. That was then challenged by the
by the
Trump
Trump administration. Yeah,
Justice Department,
great
and
guys.
then it was appealed, and it's still up in the air. And a lot of people are contending it would be about time that the Biden administration shouldn't go along with what the earlier uh,
Trump administration did. Yeah.
right. By the way, 6 Cents posted an extremely valuable article from the extremely reputable fentanyl test strips empower people and save lives. So why aren't they more widespread? So it's my view. If you are currently a user, one, through the harm reduction network that we're posting, you can find doctors who are prescribing Suboxone. If you're not using it, you and your friend should have naloxone in your pocket or their pockets, and you should have these fentanyl testing kits. So if you're using, and then at least keep yourself alive until you can get into meaningful treatment.
Yeah. Yeah. I just don't understand the reluctance to allow people to, if they're going to use, at least let's help them to use as safely as they can, and not be taking this because, and can we talk about the differences? Because there's a huge difference between the fentanyl that a hospital would prescribe somebody, like a fentanyl patch, and this fentanyl that's coming from the United States. Can we talk about the differences between them?
There are huge differences. Yeah. And I can't give you the chemical breakdown, but there is a legitimate use. What happens in the media coverage and law enforcement coverage, they actually try to reduce, prescribing of fentanyl patches for people with cancer pain. And that's one of the things that I've learned is following it. So what I'm getting at is there are appropriate uses. I don't know all the methods of administration of prescribed fentanyl, often with patches or other sort of methods of careful use for people in severe pain versus the crap coming in from China that is allowed to kind of mingle in the it's either secretly put inside heroin and other things. And for the drug dealers, this is a great boon because they don't need as much heroin, piles of heroin, because they're getting so much kick from the fentanyl. Downside, some of their customers are going to die. Okay. But then there's that lacing the drug with fentanyl. Then secondly, they are then producing counterfeit pills that look like oh,
Hmm.
Vicodin, you know, or
Percocet, Vicodin,
right, or even
Percocet,
it
and
might say
OxyContin pills.
Oxycontin.
Yeah.
And the people should know by now there isn't that much legally circulating Oxycontin anymore in the wake of all the prosecutions and reductions. So, but the notion that you would buy the pills on the street and then it could have fentanyl is super scary. And it's really, and this is what is so horrifying to me is that driving this all is a sort of punitive mindset that essentially people abusing drugs are bad people. But there's a separate myth that's being spawned by Dopesick, which I'll get to in a second. But the basically driving it is we got to punish drug abusers and they're bad people. Okay. Now there's a myth that's emerged for all of the legitimate, excellent reporting about the corrupted drug industry and like in the movie and book Dopesick. And that myth, I hate to say this, the myth that's promoted, so they swamp the market. They over medicated, they bribe doctors, bribe researchers, bribe the Joint Commission, essentially bribe the FDA and bribe the DEA. I mean, they did everything possible to corrupt everything. But the narrative that emerges, all that's accurate is the innocent white working class person who ends up getting addicted, which does happen. But one of the data points that is widely ignored is you often see a phrase where someone says they started using heroin or illegal opioids and almost always began with prescription pills. But in 80% of the cases where people end up misusing opioids, they got the pills illegally from family, friends,
Hmm.
medicine cabinets, and
Well,
so on.
where I grew up, it was very, very common that people sold pills.
Yeah,
People
and
would,
then they're
yeah,
selling the pills.
they would sell Percocet for like $10, Oxys, I don't know, $20,
Right.
whatever,
And in the pre-fentanyl era, they might have been the actual drug, but people would obtain it. Then the other thing is about 2/3 of people who end up misusing drugs often had some earlier history, and I'm not blaming them, I'm just explaining the reality, had some earlier history of drug misuse, whether it was coke or meth or things like that. But the narrative that is now, I learned this from Brooke Feldman, who's a great Philadelphia leading of the Pennsylvania Harm Reduction Network. And he helped me understand the notion of the innocent white person. So the narrative is
yeah.
the nice, noble, white, working class guy who never ever did anything illegal, proper, maybe drank or two at the friendly bar, comes in, and then there's a corrupted doctor who's been bribed with, free trips and lies to then give them Oxycontin. They become addicted, and then they ultimately die or do street drugs. And that is the narrative. But reality is, most of the people who end up getting addicted, had some previous experience. That doesn't mean they shouldn't get the best option of care. But as long as we keep up this mythology of the totally innocent white person who's completely blameless and has no history of addiction, then that helps shape a lot of our responses. And what is our response? Let's crack down on those crooked drug companies from prescribing. And let's stop those evil, crooked doctors from prescribing any opioid, because that's the only reasonable conclusion you can draw from books that are really great reporting from Dopesick and Dreamland. But Beth Macy, who wrote Dopesick and executive produced, emphasizes the value in the latter part of her book and the latter part of her series that she's producing about the value of Suboxone and medicated assisted treatment for people who do become addicted. But the main thrust of all our policies is let's stop prescribing opioids, and there's so many incentives against prescribing. And I've written about it for Huffington Post in particular. I wrote about this wonderful doctor in Montana who had a great track record, and he inherited the patient base of another doctor who was forced out of business, and he began his. They were all severe chronic pain, and they were taking opioids most legitimately, and his patient base went up enormously. And then there's the prescription drug monitoring program, made him look like a pill doctor, and then the state licensing board went after him for like 5-6 years. He ultimately proved his innocence of these charges, but he's now basically working as a medical advisor to marijuana clinics, in Montana. But he's literally was honored as like the best doctor in Butte, Montana, and he's not regularly treating anyone for anything because he's been basically harassed out of his regular work. And there was another doctor in California, Forrest Tennant, who was a phenomenally sophisticated researcher and treatment, who treated people who were damaged by what were called epidural steroid injections, and this is also being forced on patients. And there's a New York Times article on it by Sheila Kaplan, and basically people are being if they want to have any opioids at all, they're being forced into these highly dangerous medical procedures that don't really cure their pain in most cases. And one of them is epidural steroid injections.
And this could be very dangerous, right? For some patients.
Really dangerous, causes a lot of pain, often paralysis, and yet it's still going on. And now they basically and it's more lucrative for the doctors. So a lot of the pain clinics are saying, hey, if you want to have me as a doctor, maybe get a little bit of opioid, you have to go through. They're blackmailing and extorting their patients into epidural steroid injections. Tennant was treating all of these victims of this horrible procedure, and then he was forced out of his practice. And he's still the best it's called anacroiditis. I don't necessarily know how to pronounce it accurately, but it's a side effect of this procedure. And so we had a lot of chronic pain patients who suffered through this horrible procedure. And Terry Lewis, who's a scholar in Tennessee, affiliated with a top rehabilitation expert, is a big knowledgeable about this topic. They basically became refugees, known as kind of chronic pain refugees. And then they went to him for treatment, and then they shut him down. You see, it's just so crazy.
Just terrible. It's terrible what's happening. So we've covered a lot of ground here, but what I want to know is what do you think that the current administration is doing or not doing that they should be doing to try to get a handle on this thing and fix what has been a comedy of errors so far through multiple administrations, this failed drug war and all these other things?
There are a few things. The question is how to get the change to happen. So one of the things is most federal health, on the issue of chronic pain and opioids, most federal health agencies have kind of admitted, oh, by the way, you shouldn't do forced tapering too fast. It's dangerous and harmful. But they haven't bothered to publicize or inform clinicians about it. So they should be publicizing their own findings and kind of monitor what state licensing boards, insurers, and others are doing to violate the recommendations of federal agencies. And now the CDC is kind of in this ambivalent position where just 2 years ago they said, hey, everybody, please don't misapply our earlier 2016 guidelines. And now it looks like they may be moving back to reinforcing the messaging of that. That's still up in the air. So one thing is it should be part of Medicaid, with the tools of Medicaid. And that's where, if you get money from the federal government through Medicaid or Medicare, you shouldn't be engaging in horrifically terrible medication policies or addiction treatment. So one of the things, yes, opioids are great for long-term pain too. What I'm saying is that we have the tools that we can save lives, prevent suicides, and prevent overdose addictions, all of that, if we use the tools that are currently available through funding. So another element of it is, if we have 2/3 of all treatment facilities in the United States refusing to use Suboxone, that can cut overdoses at least 50%, you shouldn't get a penny of federal money for anything.
Yeah, they shouldn't get any
if
federal
you're
money.
not using evidence-based care. It's just like, forget it. Now, people will follow the money, kind of like from Woodward and Bernstein and Deep Throat. Follow the money. People will paddle away and will follow if we provide incentives. So that's the other thing, is we have to get rid of all this paperwork and barriers and training requirements and these patient limits that prevent doctors from prescribing Suboxone. Again, that is something that could be done, and there's little work around the edges by the Biden administration, but not enough. And it should be front and center. And so there's a role both in bully pulpit and of course harm reduction treatments, and basically promoting what works for harm reduction. I don't expect at this point the federal government, if Biden would want to get reelected. Oh, by the way, I'm promoting the ending of the Controlled Substances Act, and everyone can possess small amounts of cocaine and heroin. It's
math. Yeah.
You can't.
Well, don't you think though that there is some changing attitudes towards drug legalization? We've seen a proliferation.
Oh yes, I think the change.
We've seen this with marijuana. It's in my state, it is legal for medical use, and at first it was very difficult to get it legally, to get the prescription, to get the card. But it seems like now they're really opening it up, even for things like anxiety. You can get it for anxiety.
There's a marijuana industry that is built on this, trying to spread it. But apparently, unless I'm mistaken, I know this sounds crazy, but heroin and marijuana are both considered Category 1 in the
no medical use.
Yeah, no medical use, even though there's actual medical marijuana clinics. The CSA and the DEA haven't changed anything.
Yeah, this is going by states have decided to legalize, but it's still federally it's still federally illegal. But so far the states haven't stepped in and gone against the wishes, or I'm sorry, so far the federal government has not stepped in and gone against the wishes of the local states.
And then there's something
they're allowing it.
They're doing on the medical clinics, which is apparently you can't. There's some limits on how they use the money or cash, and so there's limits on whether they can deposit the money. Which
because crazy. It's an all cash business. Yeah,
it's a cash business because they're not allowed legally to create to
get a bank account to put all that money in. Yeah,
where they're providing a legal service. I mean, so that's something that can be changed. The question is, I do think that enough people are dying at such high levels that the harm reduction message is spreading, and some of that hopeful news about that is in the book Undrugging America by Maya Szalavitz. But I do think the federal government needs to do a lot more. And here's something that's kind of important politically. Now, Sam Quinones did an amazing analysis. So he wrote one of the pioneering books called Dreamland, that looked at both the fake marketing by Purdue Pharma, and then when there was a cutback in legal prescribing, how a particularly savvy small Mexican drug cartel moved in to sell heroin in middle class America. It wasn't the big famous cartels. They had this policy where they gave their drug dealers and drug honchos, they would put them on salary, they would give them health insurance, and they would worm their way into these suburban deindustrializing middle class areas, and they would literally just show up at methadone clinics where people were in line, and then they would like hype heroin, okay, to them, and they
Jeez.
helped create a heroin market, which previously white suburbanites were not taking in droves, okay, or even white urban dwellers were not taking droves. And these guys kind of took advantage of the advanced guard of false marketing for opioids. And then when people got addicted, they said, hey, now you're having trouble. We got something even better for you. Here's heroin. And by this point, the people are willing to take it. So there's, a very savvy, smaller Mexican drug. It wasn't El Chapo. It was a much smaller, savvy that wasn't under the radar of the DEA to the degree that the much bigger drug cartels were. So there's a lot you could do.
I wanted to ask you too, what is it that we can learn from these European countries, several of which have completely legalized the use of these drugs that are illegal here? Does making it legal reduce crime and reduce the harm that is caused by drugs?
It's legal, but it's kind of supervised legal. In other words, what I'm trying now, that's where Chasing the Scream is the book to read on this, because he talks a lot about the European model. So basically, you don't put people in jail, and they are available to get their drugs through medically approved clinics, okay? And then separately, then they're being routed into effective drug treatment if they want to get off the drugs. So because they're under the umbrella of a medically approved way to obtain clean needles or safe opioids or whatever their drug problem is, and they're not sent into jail and then allowed to turn into cold turkey, get on the street, and then die from overdoses within a week. So their whole model is different. It is not punitive and it is not stigmatizing. It's sort of, we want to help you. And one of the ways they do, so it is not, when they talk about legalizing, I guess if you legalize, we had in some ways kind of unofficial legalization of crack in the 1980s, when in the black areas, white cops and enforcement would just give up and not bother to go in. And it's
not worth the paperwork. Yeah, they
didn't want to bother to enforce, and then it spread like wildfire. But that is different than the Portugal model, which is, the Portugal model is medically sanctioned and no jail for drug use and treatment options. Those are some of the key elements. And
so basically, instead of locking these people up and putting them in prison, they direct them to treatment plans, and things like that to try to. So their approach is more, it's a health problem, not a crime problem.
Yes, it's treating it as a health problem, which it is. It is a health problem. Like, I have my own theories about addiction. I personally think, I've looked at some genetic studies. I'm of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. Although there's plenty of Jews who become addicts and alcoholics, I have seen some studies indicating that my particular genetic makeup may be slightly more protective against addiction, but also I didn't grow up in an environment where everybody was doing it. When I was coming of age, people were taking, which I stopped. I started taking marijuana at 15 and stopped at 21. So people were taking psychedelics, which I never took. I did some marijuana, and I stopped because I was getting too paranoid in marijuana, and I just knew my own tolerance for it was very low. It was very depressing to me. That.
Yeah. Well, don't you, that's true though. What you're saying is that environment can play a huge part. So in other words, I grew up in a neighborhood right next to the heroin capital of the East Coast of the United States, and
Right.
heroin was everywhere. And I remember growing up, like, to me, I avoided it like the plague because I saw the harm that it did to other people. But some
Right.
people that I grew up with were not that lucky. I can't tell you how many people I grew up with that died of a heroin overdose.
Well,
because it was right there. It was
Right.
everywhere where we lived.
Well,
and there was people trying to sell it to you constantly, you know?
So in my case, I came from an earlier generation where people were using psychedelics that were easily obtained. And also marijuana was very common, but the dosages of marijuana were much, much less potent than you get today. And surprisingly, I later learned that it is possible to become, you can actually become addicted in some ways to marijuana, but marijuana is way better than other.
It's psychologically, it's for sure psychologically addictive to some people. They get used to it. They want to have it every day, and then they get a little antsy if they don't have any. But it's nowhere near the level of harm.
But I do think that marijuana for adolescent brains is kind of risky.
Oh, sure, yeah.
You know, so all of these things require some nuance and intelligence, and not every circumstance for every drug is all the same for everybody. And that seems to be the worst of all worlds is what we have now. Stop opioid medication. That's for chronic pain. Drugs, just throw them in jail. Don't allow them alternatives. And by the way, we're gonna, it's just so many, and then just keep up. And then that's the horrifying element of the treatment universe. Like, I look closely at bad drug treatment programs and tough love programs. And I was following, again, the earlier work of Maya, but I did a story about this for Newsweek that was about this fundamentalist Christian tough love school that took kids from around the country whose parents were Christian believers, and they were either misbehaving, having premarital sex, or using drugs, and they sent into this basically fundamentalist torture program that existed for like 5 or 6 years, where kids were hung up down in shackles and beaten with whips and leather belts and forced into fighting matches. It went on for 5 years with the complete protection of the attorney general and local law enforcement, because they were fundamentalists and nobody wanted to go after the churches. But I also did an earlier piece that's since been expanded, where I looked at a company called CRC Health, which is the largest methadone provider, but they also had a lot of drug treatment programs that had a horrible record for maltreatment and deaths, including one of their name brand programs. And I'm going to add the caveat, some of this is alleged because they never went to prison.
Let's be careful.
Right. Some of this is alleged, and in settlements that they made, they never admit wrongdoing. But there was a particular top of the line program called Sierra Tucson, where Rush Limbaugh and Ringo Starr went for drug treatment. So you'd think, oh, this is the top of the line. But it was so, when an equity firm called Romney's equity firm, his name is slipping my mind, Bain Capital, took it over. So all they cared about was squeezing
bucks out of it.
Right,
yeah.
Right. And so I did a piece for Salon and then it's also in my book. So they took it over and they began slashing the staff and basically, just bring people in. They didn't vet people for whether they had pre-existing mental health or suicide issues. So they had about 5 to 10 deaths in the space of a few years at Sierra Tucson. And in one case, they had a very suicidal MD who had addiction problems. He killed himself while at the facility, and his body was not found on their own grounds for 2 weeks.
Jeez. So that's terrible.
Right. So
this is actually one of the things on my list. I wanted to talk about the if you could give us some insight into the treatment industry and some of the corruption in it. And so this
Yeah,
is
it's
right in
really,
line with that.
yeah, well, it's corrupt on so many ways because there's no meaningful accountability. So beyond them not offering what works, okay, beyond that, the other thing is it is basically a racket. So there's a lot of like kickbacks to doctors, some of which gets exposed where they're recommended to go to treatment facilities either for addiction or tough love programs. And it's basically an unaccountable industry that's had an extremely large share of needless deaths and suicides after people go through. And then even Dr. Drew, for instance, was a celebrity, rehab.
Oh yeah, he was pumping these things.
Yeah,
and Dr. Phil too. Dr.
Yeah,
Phil was pumping
but
these.
here's the thing about Dr. Drew's thing. According to some reporting, about 13% of the people who went through his program as of a few years ago died. Okay, so
That's
you're
a
not
pretty high percentage. Yeah, you got a
you're not
13% chance of dying if you go to his treatment program.
right.
I'd
So
stay
you're
clear.
not doing, this is according to some reporting that's been done, and so they're not held accountable for meaningful outcomes. But one of the things that's where this issue of dual diagnosis, and I really drilled into that. There's a doctor, Mark McGovern of Stanford, and others who have looked at this issue where about half the people and this is important for these facilities, about half the people with substance abuse have some kind of important mental illness issue that's debilitating and problematic. And then similarly, about half of people who have, are mentally ill and severely mentally ill also have substance abuse. And that accounts for some of the populations, in addition to the housing shortage and our economic collapse in the homeless population. But these facilities, so there was this guy who had developed this phenomenal program where it was in use in Connecticut, where he measured he could take a half day to have his experts go into a program and determine, are they using evidence-based practices? What kind of outcomes are they getting? And it was a kind of a rating yardstick and for evaluating the dual diagnosis treatments of both drug clinics and mental health. So here's what he found. He found that only 80% of drug clinics that he was invited in to study and that proudly advertised that they were offering dual diagnosis didn't meet even the barest minimum standards of competence. This isn't like you walked into any place. Then when it came to mental health treatment, only 10% met these standards. Now, here's why this is especially important. The Surgeon General came out under the Obama administration with a very, very good report about addiction issues and substance abuse. So her report found that for the entire universe of people with substance abuse, only about 10% of them got specialized treatment of any kind, whether it was good or bad. So if you take this research from Stanford and you apply it to 10%, so that means if let's say at worst only 10% of drug treatment between 10 and 20% are offering effective care, that means out of 100 people with substance abuse, only 1 or 2 are getting effective care, and 98% goodbye and good luck, like from the 2,000-year-old man. They're not getting anything of competent care. So how can you have any meaningful recovery if 98% of people are not getting competent care? And that's similar to the Suboxone debacle, where 90% of people with substance abuse do have no access to Suboxone, And another weirdo development that is happening right now is, even though people with substance abuse who could benefit from it, chronic pain patients are bizarrely being forced to admit they're addicts, quote, and they're being, if they want any, quote, opioids, they're being given Suboxone, even though its ability to prevent or help on severe pain is very limited. So what kind of crazy topsy, forcing down the throat a mildly effective, if at all, pain medication that could be used to help people with substance abuse not die, and instead it's being forced down the throat of chronic pain patients who aren't benefiting from it. I really can't figure out. That's where maybe this was designed by aliens, Steve. Maybe.
Yeah, well, this system, this whole, it's shocking the level of failure in this system, because it's not one entity that failed. It seems like all of them failed here.
Right, but there's these role models of effective care. So, like, if I was a veteran and I lived now in Birmingham, and I went to where Stefan Cortez is a treating physician at the VA, and I was having pain issues and addiction issues because he's also an addiction specialist, boy, I'd be lucky to see him. There's also about, there is a growing awareness of harm reduction movements. There's an awareness of the value of Suboxone. Now, when it comes to AA and NA, they can definitely be life-changing, but there's an anti-medication treatment attitude in those groups that if you somehow take a medication for now this varies, but it used to be almost uniform that if you took a medication for mental illness and then subsequently either for mental illness, you were kind of frowned on in NA and AA.
I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah. And if that attitude, which has been extended, like, oh, you're not really becoming sober. You're not
because you're on this medication.
If you're on medication, really, and if you're on Suboxone or methadone, well, you're not really following the 12 steps. Now, the 12 steps can be really valuable and life-changing, but it certainly should not be something that you can, gets paid for by the government as a primary form of treatment in 2/3 of all of the country's treatment facilities. That's just nuts.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of treatment stuff out there that's a little bit wacky. Like Scientology has its Narcanon program,
right,
where they put you in a sauna and give you a whole bunch of vitamins, and they call that drug treatment. I just don't understand anybody. I mean, some people fall into it. They don't know that's what they're going to get. They think they're getting effective drug treatment. They go there and get vitamins.
The Narcanon group doesn't advertise, hello, we are a branch of weirdo Scientology. They don't openly, I'm sure a lot of people know that, but yes. So the point is that there's no rigorous objective standards for outcomes. And that's where McGovern's plan, when used in Connecticut. So he had this yardstick for measuring something very clear. How good were they at dual diagnosis treatment? And he did it for both outpatient and inpatient facilities. And the upshot was, by having this government measured yardstick, they then were pressed on improving, and they wouldn't get state funds unless they improved. It was a weapon and an assessment tool. And then guess what happened? This was being promoted in 30 states by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services. So, the SAMHSA, the leading kind of mental health and drug, practice government. It was promoted. And then in 2012, just as the opioid epidemic was skyrocketing and going crazy, they yanked this tool. And so the number of states, once 30, are down to practically nothing. And this doctor, who knows in his head where effective care is, so they used to even have a website where you could look up who meets these good standards. You could go there. That website doesn't exist anymore because nobody bothered to review the domain name. and it's not there. So it turns out the knowledge of where are the really great treatment programs is in this guy's head, and fellow researchers and doctors call him up when their family members are in crisis over opioids. What do we do? Where do we go? And he tells them. But it shouldn't be up to one doctor's informal knowledge. And
Yeah,
that's where we
absolutely.
are.
We have a good comment here from Stefan Kertez saying, no one forced medical schools to hold back from training in pain and addiction. We, the medical profession, did that all by ourselves. Do you think there should be some reforms in medical schools and further, to instruct doctors to be how to handle these issues?
Yes,
right?
I think that should be. The problem with doctors, and doctors are very slow to change unless they're forced to. So they change. Here's what happened. Obviously, they were over lots of you can force change by sanctions and money. You got to if you do one of the two, sanctions if you don't do the right thing, and money if you do the good thing. If you have those tools, people will change even if their beliefs are different. But right now, part of the culture of medicine is something that a brilliant sociologist named Elliot Friedson called professional dominance, which means doctors are the gods, and doctors don't like anybody telling them what to do, and that they kind of rule the roost. And there's a culture. I'm the doctor. Who are you to tell me what to do? And that attitude basically is, helps infect medical education. We have great reformers like Dr. Cortez who want to change, but change can happen. Let me give you a specific example. It's not in opioids, but when things are so bad, changes can happen. So it used to be in New York State medical schools, interns and residents had to work 48 hours straight, as part of their toughening up process. So what was happening when you had bleary-eyed, sometimes speed-fueled interns and residents in hospitals? Well, they made loads of medical mistakes. And then when the New York Times did a series about look at all the people who died or were paralyzed or harmed because of these sleep-deprived students, then the state changed the law to make it, hey, you can't force these people to be up 40 hours straight. They have to have some break. But it was only because of outside pressure. And until there's outside pressure that's meaningful on medical schools and others, we're not going to see change. And that's one of the disturbing elements for why there's not more change is there hasn't been effective legal lawsuits against medical boards or health agencies for kind of caught by their failures about not, in other words, they should be held to account legally, but I don't know the legal justification. Somebody like Kate Nicholson, who's
complicated,
a civil disabilities lawyer, and others might, a disabilities lawyer, is these institutions whose totally negligent policies are driving up suicides for chronic pain patients or leading people into overdose deaths because of their failure to use evidence-based care and treatment. They should be sort of sued. There should be some kind of class action suit that might force them. And that's one of the problems that's going to be happening right now. There's all this publicity about these big multi-billion-dollar settlements that's happening at the federal and state level.
Yeah, we have somebody in our live chat who's a member of the class action lawsuit against Purdue.
Right. So that's great. Love to hear their views. The downside that is worrisome is it's great that they're being, in theory, held account, but how the money is actually going to be used could be really problematic. It might be just returned to the local state's general fund, or even if it goes into treatment. This is horrifying. Even if it goes into treatment, it's like an open sesame, huge pocketbook for ineffective care. They're not going to link the money to effective modalities of treatment. So we're going to have this big settlement, and people go, boy, we really got the opioid manufacturers on the ropes. Life is going to get better. It ain't going to get better. You're going
No,
to
they'll
get a
pay out
lot
a
of,
small portion of their profits in a settlement and roll on with their business. That's what I
yeah,
think will happen.
and the treatment facilities that may be awash in money, new money, aren't going to be held accountable for how it's being used. And so that is really, really, that's one of the risks. And that's why in our resource guide, we're going to be giving you the top advocates and reformers, experts, researchers, books to pay attention to, so you can learn more and keep you and your family safe.
Great. Well, I noticed we're already over time, and I could continue talking to you about this all night. I want to thank you for doing this, and because I consider it a public service, to try to raise awareness of these issues and the problems that we're facing, and maybe offer some possible solutions. And I know that you have a tremendous interest and passion towards helping these people that have been affected by the opioid epidemic. And hopefully you will agree to come back again, and maybe we can do
And you
another show.
also had mentioned that this would be the first of a series. You may be having people with lived
Yes.
experience with these issues and people on the ground, clinicians.
Yes, I'm going to be doing several interviews on this issue with different people. I've got somebody who is a minister who specializes in outreach for victims of opioid addiction and trying to help them and get them in the treatment programs. I've also got several people who were just opioid addicts that I'm going to interview so that we can personalize it and hear personal stories of their struggles and how they were able to overcome their struggles, because I think that would be important for people still struggling to hear how others were successful in ridding themselves of the scourge of this.
There's even a network I learned about in addition to the Harm Reduction Coalition, I'll have it. It's called like the Urban Survivors Organization. People who are currently struggling with addiction, and it's a way to network with others who are struggling with addiction and want to see harm reduction, both for in their own lives and to promote it outward, and also get links to effective resources so that people can help each other. That's really what is really important.
Yeah, people need to know also that they're not alone in this, and if you are
Yes.
suffering from this, there is help available. So we're going to try to provide as much resources as we can in the About section. I'm going to be editing that to get as much information in there as we can. And again, I can't thank you enough for doing this, Mr. Levine. It was a pleasure to have you here. So I'm going to throw you out of here, and I'm going to quickly read these super chats and do a quick wrap up. But don't be a stranger. And I hope that after I get some of these other interviews under my belt, you'll be able to come back and give us more insight.
I look forward to it.
All right. Thanks very much for your time, Mr. Art Levine. And what a tremendous stroke of luck to get someone who is so well informed, so passionate, and just an incredible resource into these issues. I've been wanting to cover this for a while. For those of you that are unaware, I grew up right next to someplace in Philadelphia called Kensington, and you can look on YouTube. Just put Kensington, Kensington. It's a neighborhood in Philadelphia that has been just destroyed and devastated over opioids and heroin and fentanyl now. It is the capital of the East Coast for addicts suffering with this form of addiction. And I have seen the devastation firsthand. I have had multiple friends, families, neighbors die of an overdose, or just watched many people suffer for years or even a decade in a few cases. I've known people that were long-term suffering from heroin addiction, and this is an issue that is close to me because I saw it all around me growing up. As we slowly realize that we have a platform, I feel like it's our responsibility, if you develop a good platform, that you can try to do some good in the world. And that's what we tried to do tonight. I am going to Read, recognize, and thank all the super chat donators for tonight. I apologize for not doing it as the interview goes, but you can imagine that it's a little bit distracting to stop every few minutes to read the super chats. But we certainly want to thank everybody for their kindness, their generosity, and their support. And we will read them now. Rogue Status with a kind and generous $10 super chat, who says, "This one didn't suck. Hit home, man." Thank you very much for your kindness, your generosity, and your support. Marina Mavroginis. I'm getting better at saying it every time I have to, Marina. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your kindness, generosity, and continued support with a kind and generous $2 super chat. Says, "I'm addicted to this great show and great cause." And again, with a kind and generous 99 cents super sticker purchase. Thank you very much, Marina. And finally, Marina with yet another kind and generous $5 super chat donation says, "This is such an important show. Thank you both." And we have Kelly Lee Dodge with a kind and generous Canadian $13.99 super sticker. Thank you for your kindness, your generosity, and your support. And finally, Kelly Lee Dodge with a kind and generous $6.99 super chat says, "Just want to support good people. XO." Very kind and generous of all of you. Thank you for your kindness, your generosity, and your support. I would like to tell you that this is a viewer-supported show, and the best way to support me, one of the best ways, is that money button down there. But failing that, we have a Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and we also accept PayPal donations. I want to thank that girl Jessica for a kind and generous PayPal donation. It is very much appreciated. Thank you all for your kindness, your generosity, and your support of the show. All right, friends. It's been a long week, and we have produced more content this week than we ever have in the history of our show, trying some new things this week. I want to thank all of you, especially those of you who came here expecting the normal topics that we cover. I realize that we're branching out here, but I think it's important to not pigeonhole yourself and solely cover one topic or another. We may be branching out into other subjects, and this series will continue. I want to thank our guest tonight, Art Levine, who did an incredible job helping us to navigate this crisis. My thanks to all who joined us in the live chat. You always hear me say this. I can't tell you enough how happy I am when there's an audience tonight. We had a great one. Thank you for being a part of mine. So until next time, friends, my name is Stephen Cambion. Good night, and God bless all of you.